Hello YouTube. So a little while ago I uploaded a video in which I argued that there are no possible worlds. It was a response to the way that philosophers usually think about modality, so necessity, possibility, contingency. Now, I don't think anyone brought this up, but there is an obvious response to what I was saying in that video, which is, well, there must be at least one possible world, because there's this world, the actual world. I mean, if something is actually the case, then it is possibly the case. So if something actually happens, then it is possible for it to happen. So this world exists, the actual world exists, so at least one possible world does exist. So I want to address that in this video. I'm going to suggest no. There is no actual world. So I will reaffirm my claim. There are no possible worlds, and that includes the actual world. There is no actual world. Now, first of all, I just want to specify that this is not a point about skepticism. So let's grant, for the sake of argument, that there are all sorts of things. There are trees and fields and people and cars and oceans and planets and, the common sense, all of the common sense stuff. Let's just grant that all of that's there, and let's grant that we have knowledge of it. Well, okay, fine, there's all of that stuff, but does that mean that there is a world? Does all of this stuff make a world? So, okay, there's me, there's the Earth, the solar system, the galaxy. I suppose the normal way that we think about the world is, well, the world is just everything. The world is all of it. The world is everything that is the case. The world is the totality. It is the whole that is not a part of anything else, right? So, like, I am part of the human race. The human race is part of the biosphere. And you can kind of just build out from there until you eventually get to this thing that is the whole, the totality, that is not part of anything else. All right, so first thing I want to say about this, and this is not my view, but it's just perhaps a way of creating some doubt about this idea. So basically what we're doing is we're saying, well, there's all of this stuff, and the world is supposed to be the totality of it. It's the whole that is not a part of anything else. Well, what would this look like from the perspective of something like Mereological nihilism? So according to the Mereological nihilist, there are no composite objects, there are only simples. So a Mereological nihilist will say, really there are no chairs, there are just particles arranged chair-wise. And I've got some videos that discuss some of the, some of the problems with the ordinary conception of objects that might motivate somebody to adopt Mereological nihilism. I'll link those in the comments. But, this is a view that a lot of people take seriously, right? That actually there just are no composite objects. There's just collections of particles. Well, in that case, it looks like, strictly speaking, there is no world. There is no total thing. Now, nihilists will be able to give you paraphrases, right? So, yeah, there are no chairs, but there are particles arranged chair-wise. There are no tables, there are particles arranged table-wise. So you might say, okay, well, there's no world, but there's particles arranged world-wise. Notice how strange that sounds, though. I mean, when it comes to chairs, the reason why it makes sense to say something like there are particles arranged chair-wise is because I guess we can sort of picture particles in a particular structure, right? And the particles are arranged in such a way that they achieve particular things, or they have a particular appearance. But if I was to say, well, there's no world, strictly speaking, but there are particles arranged world-wise, well, what is that, right? What arrangement is that? What is it for something to be arranged world-wise? That seems... that, like, there is no particular structure that could have, because of course, the world could be anything, right? So nihilism would be one way to lose the world, I think. But that's not going to be my approach. So here's a slightly different way to lose the world. All right. So what I just suggested there was this earlier I suggested this increasing series, right? There's all of this stuff, and you can kind of arrange this stuff into ever greater sums. So, somebody who's approaching this from the point of view of like metaphysics, they might say, well, look, if object X is part of object Y, and object Y is part of object Z, then object X is part of Z. So a metaphysician will offer these sorts of principles, like if this atom is part of the handle and the handle is part of the cup, then the atom is part of the cup. So this is offered as a kind of necessary truth about parthood relations. Or they might say, like, if X and Y exists, then the sum of X and Y exists, and the sum of X and Y, we will designate that as some other object Z. But what's happening here is the introduction of a new object language. It's a new way of talking about objects. The nihilist also, I think, introduces a new object language. So, you have some metaphysicians who, they would go by the name universalists, right? They would say that, well, any two objects compose a further sum, so they compose a further object, right? Any two objects compose a further object. Then you've got nihilists who say, well, there are no composite objects at all, there are only simples. So these are sort of two extremes. In both cases, these are different object languages. And of course, if you go for the universalist object language, in that sense, there is indeed a world. There is going to be an object that is the sum of all other things. But notice that world, I would suggest, when we talk about the world in that way, is that everything? Is that everything? Well, not really, because this is not a world that contains ordinary things. It's not a world that contains ordinary tables and ordinary chairs. What's happened is we've adopted a new technical language, right? And you can adopt this universalist language, in which case it comes out that there is a world, there is this object, but we don't have to, and this technical language doesn't capture what ordinary language captures. So, in ordinary language, I can very easily, in ordinary circumstances, I could easily give you an object that is not part of anything else. If you ask me for an object that's not part of anything else, I'll cite all sorts of things. I could say, well, I take this cup here. Look, see this cup? Well, the handle is part of the cup, but the cup itself, that's not part of anything else. That's just it's a whole object, and it's not a part. Or I'd say this table. Look, the table has legs. The legs are part of the table. The table itself is not a part. It's not a part of anything else. Now again, there's no error in saying, look, we're going to sort of stipulate a principle, right? And the principle says that if X and Y exist, then the sum of X and Y exists, and that's another object. So, given this principle, you have the cup, the table, and the table plus the cup. That's another object. But this is a very strange technical language, which again, that's a language that we don't have to adopt. So, ordinarily, there's the cup, there's the table, there's a whole bunch of other objects that are not themselves parts. Of course, this is highly context dependent, right? Because there's a sense in which, sure, the cup and the table are part of something else. I mean, if I think about it in terms of ownership, right? Let's say that I decide I'm going to leave the house, I'm going to move, I want to take all of my stuff with me, all of my possessions with me. Then I might well say, look, the table is part of It's one of the things I own. It's part of my possessions. That's why I'm taking the table with me. But when I say that the table is part of my possessions, I don't think that's the same sense of part in which the legs are a part of the table. When we say that the legs are part of the table, that's the sense dealing with like material composition. Now, my possessions, that's not itself like a material object. That's a more kind of abstract set, and that's connected to, things like, norms and legal rights and so on. There's a certain set of social conventions which then allows me to affirm ownership of a whole bunch of different things. That's not a matter of material composition, obviously. Okay then, so there's these different senses of part, right? I mean, there's like the ordinary use of the term part to refer to something is part of something else in the sense that it's, in the sense of material composition. It's like a singular object, and then the singular object has these different material parts. But of course we can use part in slightly different ways as well, where I might say that something is part of my possessions. Okay, so if we then think about the actual world, what's the actual world supposed to be? Well, if I think of this in terms of material composition, I'm saying there's this single material object. But as I've already noted, there's no, unless we adopt the language of, analytic metaphysics, I don't think there's any particular reason to suppose that there actually is this singular object that it just, in fact, even if you do adopt the language of traditional metaphysics, you can then say, well, there is the actual world, there is the object that is the sum of all other objects, but you're just using the term object in a slightly different way, and so you're actually that's not going to include all of the things that we deal with in our ordinary lives. It's not going to include my ordinary cup and this ordinary table. There's also, of course, the way of thinking. So you can also think about this in terms of, okay, maybe the actual world is like an abstraction. It's like a set of all things. I mean, again, this is like if the actual world is a mere abstraction, then I'm not going to be it's not going to be including concrete. So it's like, okay, this is instead this set. So it's like I now have a slightly different way of using the language of talking about everything. The key point is that in both cases, we are abandoning the ordinary use of the term part and whole, and then introducing a kind of technical definition. And that's fine. You can do that. But what we're left with are different languages for describing parthood relations and so on. This is my view, anyway. I'm aware this is not a view that everybody would agree with, but this is what I would suggest, right? So, I mean, this is one way, right? One way to sort of lose the world is to say, well, the only way of assigning any sense to this idea that there is an actual world where this is supposed to be, everything that there is. This is this singular thing, the actual world. Well, we get there by introducing new technical definitions of part and whole and so on. Okay, so that's one way to approach this. Another way to approach this, though, is to say, well, look, I mean, you could object to all of this and say, look, there's still some fact about like the way things are, right? Like when we talk about the actual world, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the way things really are, and there is some fact to the matter there. There's some fact about the way the world is. The world is whatever it is that is, that our theories try to answer, that our beliefs try to represent. It's the thing that, like, when we do science, or indeed when we do philosophy, we're offering these theories, we're offering these descriptions, and the actual world is the thing that is being described, is the thing that we can get it right or wrong. There's a fact of the matter about it. So, this is another way of thinking about the world, right? Like the actual world is the thing that our theories are trying to describe. So, again, I want to say, well, there isn't really such a thing as the actual world, right? So, approaching it in this kind of way, let's suppose this example is slightly modified from a case that Van Frassen gives in his book Scientific Representation. Suppose that a scientist presents a graph of deer population in a particular environment. Now we can ask, does this graph fit the actual growth rate of the population? And it looks like we can continue to entertain that question even if we grant that the scientist has done everything correctly. Like even if we grant that the measurements have been made diligently and the statistical analysis has been performed correctly and all of this, the scientist hasn't made any error in the procedure, right? We can still say, well, the real deer growth, there's a fact about the deer growth, the real growth of the population, and that fact is distinct from what is given in the graph, and the graph might get it wrong. So we're asking, like, how does this graph compare to the world? And we can do everything right in terms of following the procedures we have, but we still might not accurately represent the world. Now, I think this is totally fair enough, but in my view, what's going on here is that given a particular context, we can take it that there is a fixed answer to the question. And so in this case, right, we're trying to measure the growth of deer population. So given a particular context, we take it that there's a fixed answer with respect to how many deer there are, say. And what's happening, I think, is that we imagine kind of ideal circumstances for counting deer. We imaginatively project a perfectly reliable deer counter onto each patch of the ground in the environment at a particular time over a long period. And we imagine a graph that was constructed by such perfectly reliable deer counters. I can look at my graph, I can say, my graph, like, I'm not a perfectly reliable counter. I haven't had access to full information, etc. I've done my best, but I haven't actually been there. But I can sort of imagine, a sort of God's eye view, as it were, an omniscient being that just sees the whole environment and gives me a perfectly reliable count. So I'm projecting into this ideal perspective. But the thing to notice is that this ideal perspective itself is going to rest on various assumptions. So here are some of them, right? You need to specify what exactly counts as an individual deer. So we need to specify how exactly we are carving up the objects. I mean, if one thinks about questions like, identity over time, right? Well, what counts as the same thing over time? Obviously, over time, a deer is going to change, right? Any object is going to change over time. So what counts as the same object over time? What species concept are we using to distinguish deer from other species? Obviously, if we use different species concepts, we might end up drawing the boundaries in different ways, and that's going to give us a different count of the deer population. I mean, obviously, in the case of animals like deer, it's usually very straightforward. But certainly, I mean, there are many species concepts available, and they carve up the biosphere in many different ways. And actually, even when it comes to larger mammals, you can sometimes run into problems, like with gulls around the Arctic, for instance. If you take a standard way of carving up species is to do it in terms of reproductive isolation. So you say that a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed. But if you look at gulls around the Arctic, you have, gulls in one area can interbreed with those in another area, like in a sort of circle, but then at the two ends of the circle, the two populations can't interbreed. So that sort of thing comes up. Anyway, so what species concept are we using? What counts as the boundaries of the environment in question? So, if we're looking at deer within a forest, right? Where do we draw the line between, the forest and other environments? Similarly, what about deer that are sometimes within the forest and sometimes outside of it? I mean, it's not as though once you have an environment, like all of the all of the things that you might count are going to just stay neatly within that environment. The point is that once you have these assumptions in place, then you can say, well, this ideal perspective is going to deliver a fixed answer about what the real deer population growth is. And then we can imagine comparing our graph to this graph that has been constructed from the ideal perspective. So we're imagining like a case where somebody shares our point of view, somebody shares our classification schemes, but they have better capacities, better resources. The ideal perspective is an idealization of our own perspective, but we can throw our perspective into doubt. So, where do we draw the line between the forest and other environments? Do we use, the gradient of plant species? Do we use the gradient of light hitting the ground? Do we use items of cultural significance like fences? How do we account, like, abstract given changes over the seasons? Obviously, the exact, like, if it's like forest and a wetland, then the boundaries are going to shift over different seasons. So, exactly where exactly do we draw the line? Now, the point is that with respect to those questions, I think it's not clear to me that it really makes sense to say, well, there would be like an ideal perspective to be had on that. So, do I use the gradient of plant species to define the forest, or do I use the gradient of light hitting the ground? Well, I can't, like, imaginatively project into an ideal perspective to get an answer to that question. It's not as though there's some, like, right or wrong answer about how exactly you draw those lines, right? That's the problem. I mean, some classification schemes maybe are more useful than others, given particular purposes, but it doesn't seem like any classification scheme is in itself correct or incorrect. Once we have one of these schemes, once we have a classification scheme in place, then you can deliver particular, like, answers to particular questions. You can answer the question of how many deer were in this area. Once you define, once you sort of have some classification for what a deer is and what the boundaries of the area is and so on. But there is no ideal perspective with respect to the classification scheme itself. So, and I think this is a general, this is a problem that's going to arise in general, right? Like, I could be giving a graph of the distribution of types of stars in the Milky Way. Maybe I've miscalculated the proportion of G-type stars in a particular area, or I've misclassified a G-type star as an F-type star or whatever. Again, I can imagine a kind of ideal perspective on that, but with respect to the stellar classification scheme itself, right, like the scheme the Morgan-Keenan scheme, which gives me G-type stars and F-type stars, I mean, what's the ideal perspective on that? I mean, again, we sort of arbitrarily draw these boundaries. I could give up stellar classification entirely and just treat all stars as unique individuals. But of course, even to talk about stars is going to rest on assumptions. I have to specify what counts as a star. Like, what's the distinction between a star and a planet? Like, where's the exact line between a star and a planet? And where is the boundary between a star and space? I mean, if you include, things like the magnetic fields and the heliosphere and all of this stuff, then the boundary between a star and space starts to look very, very muddy. So the point is that when we talk about the world is the thing that fixes the truth of our theories. But there is no such thing. There is no ideal perspective completely independent of, context and language and classification scheme and so on. So that would be, so yes, that's my suggestion anyway. Okay, well, there's my case for thinking that there is no actual world. And it's sort of two points, right? The point that, like, to talk of the actual world, that I think is going to involve a kind of commitment to a certain technical metaphysical language that we don't have to get on board with, and secondly, this talk of the actual world as being like the thing independent of us that our theories answer to, well, there is no unique thing that's playing that role. Okay then. Well, hopefully that made some sense. I'm going to leave it there, and that's all. See ya.